Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com, and today I'm going to share with you a hand where I make a play that I virtually never make. And I played this hand about 8 months ago, so I really don't remember why I made this play, but I did. So in this hand, a 40-year-old player raises from the low jack seat to 300 at 50-100. A loose aggressive kid calls on the button, and I get pocket jacks in the small blind. And this is a spot where I think you can go either way between calling or 3-betting. I don't think either play is much better or worse than the other. The benefits to calling are that you keep your opponents in the pot with a lot of hands that you crush, like Jack 10 and Ace 9 and hands like that, while also keeping your range very disguised. Also, you typically don't want to play large pots from out of position, but I think calling's fine. The benefits of re-raising are that you get to build a pot with what's likely the best hand. The real big downside to 3-betting is that you have to play out of position, right? And you typically don't want to play out of position. Well, you don't want to play big pots out of position, and 3-betting makes the pot big. So I can go either way here. I think if you're going to re-raise, you want to make it about 1,500 or so. I do make it 1,450. Maybe even a touch bigger would be fine, given we are somewhat deep stacked. Typically, whenever you're out of position and the stacks are somewhat deep, re-raising larger is fine. So maybe I could make it 2,000 in that spot. I think that would be perfectly acceptable. So flop comes Ace, King, 9. I check. I think this is a board that is particularly bad for me. And whenever the board's particularly bad for you, particularly bad for your hand at least, checking is usually a good idea. So when we're checking here, you always want to make sure you're not check folding too often. So think about my range of hands that I could conceivably have in the spot and try to figure out which hands I would like to check with the intention of check raising or check calling. So if I have a hand like King Queen in this spot, which I would consider 3-betting, I would definitely like to check call that. The same thing goes for a hand like Ace Jack. If I decided to 3-bet that, I think that's a fine hand to check, because notice if you bet with a hand like King Queen or Ace Jack, if you get much action, you're usually pretty unhappy. So for that reason, I think checking with those hands is a fine option. I think checking hands like pocket jacks is good, but what other garbage hands am I trying to check here? And you have to be careful that you're not just check folding every single time you check, because if you check and you're check folding every single time, well, that gives your opponents very clear information about what they should do. They should just bet every time whenever it gets checked to them, because they know that you are check folding. So for that reason, you want to make sure that you are defending your checks a decent amount of the time. And you have to be careful that whenever you check call, your whole range is not entirely marginal made hands, such that you will fold the majority of them by the river. And that's why you need to have hands like Ace Jack in your check calling range, because if you check and your opponent bets 3 streets, say we check call a 2,000 bet on the flop, then a 4,000 bet on the turn, and then an all-in on the river, or we're really planning to check call there with Ace Jack. And it's probably close, right? And if Ace Jack is the top of our range, that's a bit of a problem, right? So we need to mix in even a few more hands into our checking range. And I'm not going to necessarily say you have to check call with all of these hands, like Ace King and Pocket Kings. I think check raising some of these hands is fine. But you have to be careful you're not folding too incredibly much. That's all this is really meant to say. Make sure you're not checking with the intention of folding too often. So in this hand, it goes check, check, and then the loose aggressive kid bets 1,600 on the button. And in this scenario, I think pocket jacks is just a fold the vast majority of the time, because whenever we call, we are going to face additional aggression a lot of the time. Our hand looks exactly like it is. You don't really want to put yourself in a spot where your hand looks exactly like it is, especially from out of position versus someone who is generally loose and aggressive. This hand is certainly not good enough to check call multiple streets, so for that reason, I think we should just fold it the majority of the time. But this time, I get a little bit frisky and make it 4,000. So why am I making it 4,000 here? I don't have a good explanation for this. This was probably one of these spots in live poker where I just made this weird read where I thought this player on the button was really getting out of line and just trying to make a cheap steal at the pot. Of course, he could just have a good hand like Ace 9 or King 9 or Ace King. But the majority of the time when this player makes this small bet size, he's going to have a pretty wide range. So if he's going to have a pretty wide range here, he's probably going to fold a lot of that if I make even a somewhat small check raise. Because he's sort of in the same spot that I would be in if I check called my pocket jacks. How is he going to realistically defend with a hand like, let's say, ace 10 if I continue betting on the turn in the river? Well, he's going to have to fold that, right? So I do think my opponent probably has enough hands in his range to the point where he is somewhat protected in this spot, meaning that he's not just going to have all garbage when he plays in this manner, because I do think he could have the 2 pairs and he could have pocket 9s for sure. So maybe this is a little bit splashy, but at this point, I kind of got the read that my opponent didn't have it, and I thought that if I check raise, it would steal the pot a ton of the time. I do like this small sizing. You have to be aware of what your opponent thinks about your bet sizing. Remember, my opponent bets 1,600. So whenever he bets 1,600 and I make it 4,000, it looks like I'm trying to get action, right? I mean, I'm giving him fantastic pot odds. He has to put in 2,400 to win a pot that's going to be, well, it's going to be about 10,000, right? So he's getting great pot odds. So he needs to win about 20% of the time to justify continuing. And for me to give him such a price, saying, I don't even think you're going to win 20% of the time, that really does scream strength to a lot of players. And some people will read into your bet size and some people will not at all. If your opponent's not going to read into your bet size at all, you're probably just better off making a little bit bigger to try to really ensure hands like all kings and maybe even some weaker aces fold. But if your opponent is very confident that you have a hand like a set or a top 2 pair, and your opponent is a reasonable player, he's not an idiot, right? If he's competent, he's going to look at that and realize that he's probably in bad shape and he should just fold. So I really don't think I'm doing a ton of check raising in this spot in general with my strong hand, so it's probably a little bit optimistic to do it with my bluffs. But at the same time, I think this is a nice play. I think if you're going to get out of line, this is an okay hand to do it with. Obviously, we're not loving this spot at all, but there really aren't very many good bluffing hands that even make sense. Some hands that make more sense would be hands like Queen Jack, Queen 10, and Jack 10. But really, I'm not even sure if I re-raise those before the flop, so those may not even be in my range. So if those aren't in my range, what else do I have here that wants to check with the intention of check folding some portion of the time? And that's just going to be the underpairs, right? I probably don't want to check raise King Queen as a bluff. What else could we have? I mean, there's just not a whole lot. Maybe I would prefer to actually not have a Queen Jack or 10 in my range, because that would make it more likely that the loose aggressive kid has a hand like, well, the gut shots that I just mentioned, that would then fold to a bet. So maybe this is actually not a good hand to have in my range. Or maybe this is not a good hand to check raise because my opponent, this takes away some combinations of Queen Jack, Queen 10, and Jack 10 that my opponent could have. Not Queen 10, I guess, but takes away some combinations of those 2 that have the Jack in them. So, I don't know. This is something I really don't do very often, but at this point, apparently I got the vibe that my opponent was bluffing, and I decided to go for it. Sometimes you just decide to go for it in live poker, and maybe this is a little bit overly aggressive. I'm sure all the game theory optimal players are looking at this and saying, oh my god, you're just committing a horrible blunder by check raising here. But live poker is a funny game. Sometimes you just know your opponents don't have it. And if your opponent doesn't have it, and you can reach out and steal that pot 95% of the time, you're making a big blunder not getting out of line and stealing that pot. So don't be afraid to go for it whenever you think it will work. And if you see that the times that you go for it, if it is succeeding a large portion of the time, well, you should probably do more of that. And if your bluffs like this virtually never work, well, you probably need to reassess your situations and play a little bit better, or play a little bit closer to game theory optimal. But if you play a ton of live poker and you are generally pretty good with your reads, doing this kind of thing will definitely add a nice bump to your win rate. But like I said, I do this. I mean, I can't think of the last time I did this with a hand like this, but I decided to do it this time and it ended up working out. So that's going to be it for this hand. I want to thank you all for watching these videos at Poker News. If you enjoy this, let them know on Twitter at Poker News. And be sure to check back next week for another educational poker hand. Thanks for watching.